Stephen, Pet Sematary is the first screenplay that you've adapted from one of your novels. Tell me, what are the pros and cons of taking something from the written page and putting it on the big screen?
Well, you've got a lot of material in a book, and if you adapted it word for word and line for line, you'd probably end up with a sort of movie, you know, people would they'd have to serve dinners like on an airplane. You've got about a 2-hour window to make your presentation and get out. So you have to kind of whittle the work down, and I think the real challenge is to try to leave everything in, but to scale it down to a size where the movie can handle it.
What about visualizing some of the things that we imagine? Is there a danger there in actually trying to take from people's imagination and put it on screen?
Well, I'll tell you, you write it into the screenplay and you hope. It varies from case to case. There are a lot of smart people that are in charge of helping you visualize for the camera what you made up in your mind. I can remember doing an early draft of a screenplay for Cujo. They didn't eventually shoot my draft, but there's a section in the book where this big St. Bernard dog literally attacks this little Ford Pinto and smashes his head into it. And I can remember my wife saying, they'll never be able to do that in a film, will they? And my response was, that's their problem. And as it turned out, they did. They had a thin shell of aluminum foil painted to look like the side of a Pinto with all these, you know, the little styrofoam balls they put in mailers behind it. And it worked really well. So they're really geniuses about that. And usually it works out.
Well, tell me, there's an interesting story that goes behind Pet Sematary and how you came up with the idea for the novel. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, almost everything that's in the novel and in the movie up to a certain point really happened. The novel concerns a doctor and his family that move into a town in Maine. He's going to become the doctor at the local infirmary. And in my case, I moved into a small Maine town to become writer-in-residence at the same university. The character in the book has a little boy. I have a little boy. My daughter had a cat that she loved very much, and the little girl in the book has a cat. In both cases, there was a pet cemetery behind the house where the main characters, the real ones, my family, and the fictional ones, the Creed family, lived. And my daughter's cat was run over in the road. There was a lot of heavy traffic, a lot of big fertilizer trucks that went back and forth. And she was very upset. It was her first experience with death. And about 6 months later, my little boy almost ran into that road while a truck was coming. And this started to tick over in my head when I thought about how close it had been, and the result was Pet Sematary.
Well, now, many of your stories are set in Maine. What is it about that atmosphere that is conducive to a Stephen King novel?
Well, I don't think it's just the atmosphere. I think that I would be writing some kind of spooky stories wherever I live because it's the way that I'm built. It's what I'm built to do. But because I grew up in Maine, I grew up in a rural area and I love it, that's where the stories tend to be set. If I'd grown up in Manhattan or if I'd grown up in Nashville, I suppose I'd be writing different stories with different settings. But I think that the effect would be about the same.
Well, I understand you make a cameo appearance in Pet Sematary. Reverend King. Tell us about that.
Oh, I'm not sure that I want to. People really ought to go to the movie to see it. I did do a little part. It's kind of in a sense, a Hitchcock turn. I guess it must be a little pressed ham in my character because I've done cameos before. And Mary Lambert, who directed the picture, asked me if I'd like to play a small but pivotal part, and I agreed to do it.
So we'll have to go to the theater and look for you real closely.
I'm afraid so.
Well, let me ask you something. Now, when people meet you for the first time, do they have a preconceived idea about you, what you're going to be like? Do they think you're going to be some dark, sinister character?
I think in most cases they think I'm going to rip out their throats and drink their blood. But I've only done that on 3 occasions, and I got away with it.
Well, now, what is the biggest misconception, do you think, that we have about Stephen King?
Well, probably that I'm this scary guy that goes around in a cape and only comes out at night, and that I always feel that people must be a little bit disappointed when they meet me in person. I'm really an ordinary guy. In fact, I have the heart of a small child. I keep it in a jar on my desk.
Well, speaking of small child, when you were a small child, what scared you when you were growing up?
I think everything scared me, but given my circumstances at that time. I was raised by my mother. My father was gone. And I think that if anything scared me, it was the possible loss of my mother and becoming an orphan. I can remember watching Bambi as a small child, and when Bambi's mother got cooked in the forest fire, I can remember being scared for weeks after that, thinking, isn't that awful to be without a mother in the big wide world?
What about now as an adult? What scares you now?
Oh, I guess probably the deaths of my children. That idea scares me. The idea of thermonuclear war. There are a lot of fears that press in on us, and I think that's one of the reasons that I tend to, when I get scared, I turn on my imagination and try to communicate my fear to somebody else. Mm-hmm. This is the sort of thing, you know, if you're mentally disturbed, you go to a psychiatrist and you pay them $75 or $100 an hour to hear what scares you. And what I do is I write it down and people pay me.
Mm-hmm. And so is this good therapy for you, just to kind of express your fears on paper?
It's the best.
Well, let me ask you something else. Whenever I read one of your novels or see a film, we talked a little bit earlier about Cat's Eye, I always feel very weird, very strange, and very dark. Now, I'm just wondering, what kind of process do you go through when you're sitting down to write? Because I have to tell you, these things give me the creeps. What about you?
I'm usually laughing like hell because I'm imagining people like you sweating bullets. You got to have a sadistic turn of nature to do this. Mm-hmm. And I do. And I like to, if I can, like with Pet Sematary, I like to put it in a context that's a little bit more realistic so we can examine our real fears as well as having a good time with the make-believe that's going to go away when the book's shut or when the movie's over. But I like to get an audience reaction. I suppose in a way that that's childish. It's a little bit like, oh, I don't know, if you grew up with a large family, a lot of brothers and sisters, most kids can remember sitting at the dining room table and chewing up a mouthful of food and then going, oh, look at that, and grossing out your brothers and sisters. And that's a little bit of like where I'm coming from.
Well, now, do you bounce these ideas off of your wife, like, oh, here's an idea, do you think this will scare him, or do you try different things out, or?
No, I'm only really interested in my reaction. I write for myself more than anybody else. And my feeling is, if it scares me or if it engages me, the scares come secondarily. What I'm really interested in is telling a story that's going to grip people. And if it's a story that I want to hear, I make that jump and assume that other people will want to hear that story too. And it's worked out pretty well.
Where do you find the inspiration for some of these characters?
Usually in the mail at the end of the month when the bills come. It comes from everywhere. It really does. A lot of it is just observation of what people are up to on the street, people that you know, people that you don't know, things that you see, and at some point that magic thing happens. Your imagination kicks in and you say, yeah, well, this happened, but suppose I added this, and you bring them together and boom.
Mm-hmm. Now, I've got to ask you something here. Do you get scared when you go to a Stephen King film?
No, that's for other people.
So you already know what's going to happen, so it doesn't faze you.
That's it. I know what's going to happen. There was one case at the end of the movie Carrie, when the girl is praying at Carrie's grave and that hand comes out of the ground and grabbed the other lady, the other girl. I jumped in. I knew it was coming, but I still wasn't prepared.
Well, let me ask you, of all
there's a moment in Pet Sematary, too.
You won't tell us when.
I won't tell you when. I'll just say, and anybody who's read my fiction knows enough to do this anyway, watch out for what's under the bed.
Oh, great. Thank you. I'll go home tonight and I'll do just that. Well, let me ask you, of all your novels and films, is there one that you feel came across particularly well? Do you have a personal favorite? I know I do.
I would say that given everything from the acting, the special effects, and from the texture of the film, that Pet Sematary is my favorite movie.
All right, well, we'll have to go see if it's one of our favorites. It opens April 21st. Stephen King, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure, and I will go look under the bed when I get home.
No, just make sure you keep the blankets pulled up because they're magic. It can't get you then.
The troll, yeah. Goodbye.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.